we've talked about Isaiah 6 so often, but please note this. We've done it because Voss keeps circling back to it.
Right.
The reason we do
Right.
it is that we're following Voss. And I think to put this, I try to find new ways to put it. Um, Isaiah 6 is, let me relate it to Moses in Exodus 24. I've probably done this before. We have, Camden. But in Exodus 24, you get the virtual high point of the Mosaic covenant. What is it? Moses is brought up to the earthly mountain, enveloped by the glory cloud, and has fellowship with God for 40 days and 40 nights. It's the high point of the Mosaic covenant. What happens with Isaiah is he is lifted or given prophetic vision into not the earthly mountain of God's glory, but what in Hebrews 12 is going to be called heavenly Mount Zion, or what in Hebrews 8:5 is going to be called the heavenly temple. And and in the thing, and this moves us in the direction of a theme that Voss begins to develop on page 248 on holiness, moral purity, and the holy theocratic dwelling of God. What happens is that when Isaiah sees that fullness of God's holiness, the radiance and splendor of the divine majesty seated on the throne in the heaven temple, surrounded by the living seraphim, worshiping him constantly and ascribing glory to his name. What happens is Isaiah comes into contact not just with a God who has moral purity, but a God whose being and character is such that nothing impure can remain in that gaze, in that proximity to the presence of God. And it begins, you could say this, it begins the tremors of hell, as it were, as he condemns himself. He feels the weight of God's holiness in the form of wrath that is ready to break out against him, as it were, and he covers his mouth. He condemns himself. The condemnation he's going to bring upon Israel, he announces upon himself. But then God, in his grace, typifying the movement that's going to come from the one seated in heaven to come down, to make atonement, and to enter back into the presence of God, returning Isaiah into his presence. The angel comes forth with the coal. Sin is atoned for, and he stands. But the point here is that it's the in the prophetic era, it's the first clear, explicit vision of the archetypal heaven temple that has one primary purpose: to be the theater of that holiness that evokes never-ending worship. And it really starts to raise the question, Camden, and Voss starts to deal with this on page 248. What are or how should we think about the relationship between what Voss calls God's majesty, holiness, and the places where his glory or his holiness dwell? And I got that, just I think you did too, Camden. I can just say that when I was reading through this material, my heart was really starting to burn within me. There's some beautiful material on page 248.